So let's talk about NGRX effects before we actually get going and started with the package. So what is NGRX effects? We want to answer this question before we start diving in and start exploring the APIs. I like to kind of understand the thinking behind the reason that these packages exist. So essentially, it's a side effects model for NGRX Store. Now this means that we can perform various side effects, which we'll come on to momentarily, outside of the NGRX Store package. So let's see what we can actually do with the effects package before we just add it to our application. So we can listen to NGRX Store actions. This is really nice because, for instance, let's say we had some kind of load event. We want to load something in our application. Now we could do this inside a reducer, but this would actually be creating an asynchronous request inside something that's considered a pure function. So immediately, those types of things are kind of the wrong approach. So we want to take the right approach with a side effects model that's built for the technology that we're using. So importantly, we can, for instance, dispatch some kind of load event, and we can actually listen to this action inside an effect. We can then communicate outside of Angular using something like Angular's HTTP package, or for instance, something like a WebSocket, where it's outside of the Angular ecosystem. We're dealing with outside of the Angular world. So we can communicate outside of Angular, and as a result, we're isolating those side effects away from our components. And this can be something as simple as just routing. Now, typically, we would do some routing, and we'd inject Angular's router into a component, we'd listen to a callback in a service, and then we'd redirect away. However, this doesn't really give us a very scalable state management architecture. So we're going to dive into the conceptual side of what NGRX effects is, and then we're just going to dive in and actually start coding it. This is the best way that we can start learning effects. So what I'm going to call this is the effects flow. This is the flow of everything next to our NGRX store and how the data flows, or the events and the communication flows between the store and the effects and back to our components. We should be used to this diagram by now. We've seen it before, where we have a component which dispatches an action, it gets sent to the reducer, we get that new state which is bound back to the store, and then because we're subscribing to the store, we can then pull in those new changes. So this is really nice. We understand this. It's nice and clean. There's one-way data flow, and this makes things nice and predictable. Let's introduce effects. You can think of effects as outside of the store. It's just a mechanism that we can use to go and fetch data to then put back in our store. So we're essentially jumping out of the store momentarily and then bringing something back. That's pretty much the thinking process. So we mentioned that we can in fact listen to store actions. So this is what would happen when we use an effect. We can set up an effect to say, okay, I'm actually interested in this load action as well. And it may be that our reducer is also interested in the same action. The difference is the reducer is a pure function. It's synchronous. Nothing is actually happening inside of there apart from taking data and merging it as a new state. However, when we deal with an effect, we can actually use something like a service or a WebSocket to go off to the server. So at this point, our effect can say, okay, Angular service, we want to actually do something outside of this store now. So it's time at this point where we can continue the journey and we can say, okay, we've hit the server. At this point, we can say, okay, give me some particular JSON. We could return a collection. We could post some data. We could do anything we like outside of the Angular ecosystem. So once we've got the data that's come back from the server, we then get this as an observable inside of our service. We get an observable of the response. So what we can do is essentially plug in our service to an effect, which is an observable stream. So because in our case, what we will have is a service that returns an observable and an effect, which is an observable stream. We can then map over things, and we want to actually get the data back inside the reducer at this point. When something asynchronous is complete, we want to then pass it back to the reducer. So the question is, how at this point do we get something back into the reducer? Our effect is kind of outside of the store, it's in control of something else, so we want to, in fact, dispatch an action from our effect. Now, let's assume that our first action dispatched a load. It might be that the effect listens to the load event and grabs our service and says, okay, go and fetch me all of this data. We bring back the data, and inside the effect, we can then dispatch a success action, which means that automatically we can listen to that in our reducer, and we get given the response as the action.payload. So it's just a nice outside of the store. We can make an asynchronous request, we can bring it back and dispatch a new action, such as a success, and that will be brought back to the reducer. And then we have the whole lifecycle trip where we merge new state, and then it comes back and renders to the component. And then we can start the journey all over again. If our component dispatched a new action, we could listen to something in the reducer, we could listen to something in the effect, we can make an asynchronous request and bring it back to our store, which is our centralized location and our single source of truth. So that's our nice primer to the effects, thinking about what the effect is. We don't have to think about code at this point. We're going to explain things as we go, as we continue through this next chapter.